between the contributions of literary studies and communication studies, especially in an American context, to cultural studies. Since communication studies, in a sense, mediated the entry to America of British cultural studies via the Illinois School, James Carey, and then the second generation, Lawrence Grossberg and Carey Nelson and so on. And I think at least Carey is not so well known because he didn't write as much.
So the contribution of the communication school, you're talking about the English communication school,
yeah, the College of Communication in Illinois, and then I'm in the College of Communication at Texas, so I think there's a slightly different angle there.
Okay, the contribution of communication to cultural studies.
Right, yeah, of the field of communication. Since so many of the interests in the early days of British cultural studies moved from literary to media.
So, I'm going to ask you about the intellectual history of cultural studies. We focus it on the contribution of the field of communication to cultural studies. And then perhaps the role that, Orwell played in the early beginning of cultural studies.
One thing that interests me is the different national traditions that have contributed to cultural studies and how their contributions have been mediated by different groups from one culture to another. For instance, many people today have a very vague idea about what cultural studies is, and they may associate it with post-structuralism or postmodernism from Parisian thinkers, or they may associate it with something having to do with punk or cyberpunk or quasi-American criticism, or indeed British cultural studies. And in fact, that's the tradition that I'm most familiar with as having originated some formal approach to culture as a phenomenon. And so when I think of cultural studies, I think of Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall in the early days of the New Left Review, and the way in which their work later became radicalized during the later days of the New Left Review in the mid-60s, and how that was mediated to America via communication studies departments, such as those at Illinois and throughout the Midwest. And in fact, one of the neglected stories of American cultural studies is probably the contribution that James Carey and some of the other people working with him, especially in the field of communication, made in bringing over Stuart Hall and some others in the late 60s and early 70s. There was a conference during the early 70s that served as a kind of bridge to British cultural studies organized by James Carey and others at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. And so, in a sense, as far as American cultural studies is concerned, in this sense of having participated in the development of British cultural studies in the late 60s and 70s, it's not so much English and comparative literature departments working out of post-structuralism and structuralism, so much as communication studies departments that have played a formative role. And I suppose that's understandable given that the big development in Britain in working on cultural studies had been the move from the focus on literature to culture and society, and that came to mean mass culture and popular culture, and so the mass media. And communication studies in America were much better positioned to be studying mass culture and mass media than English departments and comparative literature departments. So, although probably today in the wider academic scene, cultural studies is more associated with English and comparative literature departments in the States, the tradition is actually one that began in communication studies departments and began with communication studies having mediated the flow of thinking from early New Left British cultural studies through the Illinois School at Champaign-Urbana to a wider network of communication studies departments in the States.
How did that change the whole nature of the study of culture? Previous to that, we had people who studied mass culture, leading people like White and the Catholic school. In what way did the focus shift with the introduction of these new ideas?
That's an important question. I think that's a history that is yet to be written, but it's very clear that the big debate in the mid-60s that centered first on the New Left Review was whether or not there was going to be a native British or Anglo-American tradition that would emerge as the dominant mode for cultural studies, or if European literary and cultural theory would play a central role or even dominate. And of course, what happened in the days of the New York Review, in the move from Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson and Stuart Hall to the later 60s, when Perry Anderson and others began to take over European theory, was that French and German theory, especially Frankfurt School theory, began to predominate on the Anglo-American scene as well. So I think one contribution that communication studies made by introducing British cultural studies through an American context was to emphasize an American nativist tradition, and also to maintain the centrality of a British tradition, because it was not the French or the Germans who were invited to Illinois and who later were addressed specifically in the work of James Carey and others in communication studies departments. It was the British, and also some American pragmatists, Dewey and others. So in that respect, I think the way in which American cultural studies developed in the late 60s and early 70s turned out to be very different from British cultural studies. Unlike British cultural studies, i.e. the radicalizing of the New Left Review under Perry Anderson, we didn't turn to European theory until much later in communication studies.
Mm-hmm. One of your specialties is Orwell. What role did Orwell specifically played in the whole development of an interest in popular culture and cultural studies?
One of his great influences, I think, had been to legitimize the study and the public sharing among intellectuals of popular culture as something that could be talked about, written about, and could be the object of an open expression of affection. And he has several essays in which he addresses his own great affection for popular cultures and talks about how from his earliest boyhood he had immersed himself in boys' newspapers like The Gem and The Magnet and so on. And several of his novels, like Coming Up for Air and Kiki Expedistra Flying, reflect his immersion in popular literature and comic books and popular songs and the penny postcards and the vaudeville music hall era. And I think much of this is attached to a kind of nostalgia for his own Edwardian boyhood that you later see also reflected in some of the nostalgic writings of Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart in the late 50s in Culture and Society and the Uses of Literacy. I would say that above all, he liberated intellectuals to address something more than simply high culture. And in doing that, he was able to convey the great love that he had of popular culture without any of the guilt that some intellectuals were feeling during the period for really liking that stuff but not being able to admit it openly, and certainly not being able to write about it. And I think too, as a mode, however unsystematic as criticism, however impressionistic by some standards of theoretical discourse today, he also contributed by inaugurating the idea that we didn't need a separate aesthetics for popular mass culture. Instead, one could simply use the tools of high culture analysis and apply them when needed to different kinds of popular culture artifacts. So it was a very task-oriented criticism that he introduced, and he simply would write about the boys' newspapers in the same way that he'd write about a popular novelist, and to some extent even about a well-known novelist, high culture status like George Orwell. So in that respect, I think he also had a big influence. Mary McCarthy made the famous remark in the late 60s that George Orwell virtually invented popular culture studies as a domain of activity worthy of intellectual pursuits. And she was speaking for her generation, his generation of Anglo-American intellectuals. So I think that there's a recognition among literary intellectuals that Orwell pioneered popular culture studies of an anti-theoretical or non-theoretical sort. He was the one who first admitted that he loved the stuff and that it was of sufficient sociological and cultural importance that it was worthy, indeed necessary, of study. And so, despite the fact, or even because of the fact, that he's very much an old-fashioned literary intellectual who never claimed that popular culture had any great aesthetic merit, on the other hand, he contributed to the decision of intellectuals and then later academics to make popular culture a subject of study because he always stressed its immense sociological importance. And that, of course, in the later 60s and 70s was no longer considered to be an adequate claim. By the 60s and 70s, many people were claiming that popular art was just as good or even better in many respects as traditional high art. Orwell never went that far. So in many ways, he's an intellectual of his day. He subscribed to the old Arnoldian idea that culture is the criticism of life and literary culture is the highest form of artistic expression. From the standpoint of some avant-garde intellectuals of the 60s and 70s who were exalting happenings and Andy Warhol and the Beatles and so on, and these were the partisan review intellectuals among whom Mary McCarthy associated, they had less affection for Orwell, but they always were faithful to the historical fact that it was because of his stress on the cultural and sociological significance of popular art that the first breakthrough was made.
But also the political significance of popular culture and his involvement in trying to put out a conflict.
One of his ideas was that the left was humorless, and that the left was also missing the boat when it came to exploiting the potential of popular culture for a left politics. And so he attempted to organize with the children's short story writer and the Socialist Tribune contributor, Jeffrey Treese, a left-wing comic. And the project fell through, though he and Treese had even bought a printing press, or arranged to buy a printing press that would handle the comic. This was in 1940-41, when he was searching around for work. So he definitely believed that popular culture could have a liberating and populist thrust, and in a couple of his essays he makes a critique of many of the papers that he had loved, like the Gem and the Magnet, being owned by right-wing concerns, Lord Camrose and the Amalgamated Press, and said that the fact that they seemed to be owned by these interests and always to reflect a sunny image of Britain circa 1910, before the Great War and without any mention of class differences and so on, was not surprising, and was certainly a way in which some conservative interests were being buttressed through popular culture.
Well, the other thing that I want to mention is, what was it? In terms of the political importance of it, and never mind, there's any other I had when we were talking, and now it's just food for. But cultural studies, you want to say anything about maybe reframe what you said about the contribution of Philippines. So you made it very specific. You talked about American. Do you have any comments to say about Canada by any chance? Just to make it more.
Well, sometimes you hear popular culture studies debates today being framed in terms not so dissimilar to the general culture debates around the New Left Review in the mid-60s. That is to say, there was an early cultural New Left from the late 50s and early 60s associated with the magazines University and Left Review and the New Reasoner. And then a later Left Review, New Left Review, in the late 60s, early 70s that was radicalized, much more committed to European theory, and disgusted with Labour Party gradualism and wanting to break out and go further left. That kind of debate is in some ways, I think, being replayed, especially in the Canadian-American scene, between what's sometimes thought of as left populism and postmodernist cultural studies, with much of the left populist discussion tending to be more insular or more nativist in a British, American, or Canadian sense, and less enamored of French postmodernist theory. And with, of course, the postmodernist side committed to European theory, believing that it is truly liberating and that the manifold possibilities that popular culture studies affords of trying finally to bridge the gap between the cultural avant-garde and a mass audience could be achieved. And this is the great problem, of course, the avant-garde has had during the century, that it has tended, for whatever its rhetoric, to finally be an elite that speaks among itself or fellow converts. So here, popular culture studies, cultural studies, can serve as a kind of academic intellectual avant-garde that would finally, via criticism, return much of the work of the avant-garde to the people, to a populist audience, and so then serve as a left politics that way. So that I find to be just an interesting reenactment of a moment in intellectual history from the early 60s, in the same way that you saw, especially in the British scene, a division in the early and later New Left between British and European theory or criticism. You see today something somewhat similar in a left populism, and the populism tends to focus on the praxis of everyday life. That's the old concern of the early Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall and New Left Review. And on the other side, a postmodernist criticism derived from Parisian thinking that is rather skeptical of focus on everyday practical concerns and much more interested with conceptual problems of the simulacrum and of image and of technological determinism and so on. So I think the coincidence of these two moments from the early 60s and now the early 90s is very fascinating, and perhaps there's some lessons to be learned.
Wonderful. That was a great wrap-up, actually. We could use that as a kind of a frame for a lot of the stuff that we've been taking, especially the theoretical detail. So,
there was one other thing that we had talked about yesterday I could mention.
Be as spontaneous as you want.
Oh, okay. Well, I was getting this kind of question all the time in the mid-'80s, and of course even now, about George Orwell. What would he say today about, and you fill in the blank, and anything from nuclear stockpiling to contemporary music to state of cultural studies. Here's somebody who pioneered popular culture studies as an intellectual domain of activity. What would he say today about the people who have built on his early work? And I personally think that he'd be much more sympathetic to the kind of criticism that has been characterized as left populism, that is engaged with the praxis of everyday life. From his standpoint, some of the work of certain postmodernists might seem to be utterly unintelligible and perhaps not at all populist because it would be relatively completely inaccessible to a mass audience. On the other hand, there was a side of him that was very quixotic and pleasure-seeking, and not at all puritanical or ascetic, despite the reputation that he was later to have in the 50s in London. And sometimes I think the emphasis on sheer play and pleasure that some postmodernist cultural studies critics have would meet with his great approval, because shattering the hegemony of any single monolithic approach to cultural study would have met greatly with his approval. And that it reflects his own empirical cast of mind. Whatever would be helpful to the task at hand would be something that he would be eager to consider. So what would he say about cultural studies today? I think that he'd probably have a greater affinity with the tradition that has more directly emerged from British cultural studies via the early Raymond Williams. But I think he'd also be open to some of these newer approaches.